Norsca. Berserkers, rage-induced fighters, supported by monstrous infantry of many types and powerful mammoths and other single entities. In this video I'll show you every unit from the roster before and after research, redline skills and XP. I will also show you the lords and heroes and their abilities in campaign. So your army has the advantages of having damage-dealing infantry, great monstrous infantry, great single entities, and some disadvantages, of course. Short-range missiles, average cavalry, chariots, and they do lack artillery and overall range. In addition to that, they do have a short roster. So overall, their emphasis is on charging in, doing a lot of damage, and it's actually one of the most interesting rosters to punch through enemy lines. But yes, overall, these are the sort of advantages and disadvantages that you can expect from Norsca. In terms of army specifics, you have Rage. This is a passive ability that has intensity, so the longer the unit spends engaged in melee, the faster they will gain the physical resistance, leadership and melee attack. So up to 10% physical resistance is always nice. Leadership plus 8, melee attack plus 5. It is great as long as the unit is not broken. They will gain this effect, which is always awesome to fight better in melee overall, and it fits so well into the playstyle of Norsca. Heavily armored and shielded, Wulfric is a very good melee fighter. Tons of armor and that silver shield to help his survival. With an amazing 70 melee attack and 50 melee defense, he's quite a menace in close combat. He has a lot of weapon damage too, but it is not mainly armor piercing, so be careful when engaging heavily armored targets. He also has a good charge bonus, so make sure to use that in combat. In terms of ability, Seafang is a wind spell that also causes frostbite with relatively decent magical damage. Then we have Hunter of Champions, and this one has an upgrade later on. So this is Hex to a enemy lord or hero, of course, giving them minus 30 armor, minus 40 melee defense, and minus 45% speed. It makes them immensely vulnerable. It later has an upgrade which makes the targeted units unable to move, which is perfect. Then we have the Sword of Torgald. It's a nice base weapon damage buff, great to help finish off an enemy. Throg is a very powerful melee lord focused more on doing damage. He has high hit points, low armor, very good speed actually for a lord, great melee attack with frostbite, so good luck running away from him, and good melee defense. Main advantage is still not that, it's the armor piercing weapon damage that he has and a bonuses versus large. So he's quite deadly versus large targets, especially lords or heroes on mounts. Don't forget to charge him in as well to take advantage of its nice bonus. As for his abilities in campaign, Copious Vomit, 3 charges of a magic missile with rather decent armor-piercing damage, only usable if he's out of melee. Regeneration is also very much a key component to Throg's survivability versus any other opponent. He also can get the Chilling Aura, which is basically a hex that reduces enemy speed in range, passive aura ability. And finally we do have the Wintertooth Crown ability. This gives every ally in range unbreakable for 24 seconds, very useful under the right circumstances. The Marauder Chieftain is a very standard melee fighter with average armor, but with the bronze shield, better melee attack than melee defense, still quite optimal for what is basically a standard lord. A good weapon strength, although does lack some armor piercing, and a good charge bonus that you should always take advantage of. So in essence, he's still quite a good frontline or support lord, but just be wary against tougher opponents. So in campaign you can get some choices here. You can only choose one of these basically, so all that I'm gonna state You won't be able to have all 4. You can only choose one of them. So it always ends with one ability. Let's go for it. Berserk, you can get it, which is an augment, basically an intensity-based effect that has 2 stages. First, physical resistance can go up to 20% and melee attack up to 13. Second, it does the same, but adds rampage. This is improved, of course, the longer he keeps in melee. Then we can get Seduction of the Serpent. This imbues his attacks with Discouraged, lowering enemy leadership by -16. It's a powerful effect, actually, and it also gives him melee defense and leadership. You can also gain regeneration, very useful, and poison attacks there, which is always nice, but regeneration, you already know, it's really powerful. And if you prefer a more direct damage approach, you can get the Fireball spell, which is always good. You will get 4 charges, very long range, one of the finest in the game. Available in 3 lores, Death, Fire, and Metal, this is your typical caster hero. Very poor melee stats, so ensure he keeps safely behind some of your troops. He may be able to defeat an enemy caster or something, but it is always best to avoid melee combat, given his low armor, low melee attack, low melee defense, even low weapon strength and hit points. Yeah, just avoid combat altogether if you can. Use it as a last resource in that regard. A very powerful hero, the Skin Wolf Werkin, has good armor, excellent speed, good melee attack, but low melee defense, so be careful. The main advantage is that he has armor piercing, weapon damage, focus, and the bonuses versus large. So he's perfect to catch up to those caster heroes or lords and make quick work of them, especially if they are already on a mount or they are innately a large target. So in campaign, he can get regeneration, making him very powerful in combat. Just be wary of any fire damaging foes. Frenzy, which is always nice, and increases all your offensive stats. It also gives you immune to psychology, very useful. Then we have Ruinous Flesh. This passive ability increases armor and missile resistance to all allies in range, and you can either get that one or you can get the Frenzied Assault, which is an augment in an area affecting all allies, giving them more charge bonus and melee attack. So either a defensive one or an offensive one, your choice. A second caster choice, the Femir Belfiend, is available in Fire or Shadows. It's a good hybrid spellcaster, decent armor, good speed, so he can run away if necessary, or charge in if necessary as well. Poor melee attack, but it does have magical attacks, and it does have standard armor. Poor melee defense, good armor piercing weapon strength though. It is an interesting set of offensive and defensive capabilities that can sometimes surprise the enemy, although it should still avoid a bit of combat unless you spot a nice opportunity for him to shine. In campaign, it has the From the Mist passive ability, so missile resistance plus 20% when the leadership is higher than 50% of the base. Very basic one, but still very important one for the Femir Belfiend. Starting off with the Marauders, they are shielded, so they do have that bronze shield, very good to withstand some missile fire. Not a lot of armor, so be careful with that. They do have pretty good stats overall. Good melee attack, decent melee defense, weapon strength is still higher than some, and still a good charge bonus, and they do have that rage ability. Now, in the late game, of course, you're going to have better options, but just look how improved their stats become. They kind of become a sort of tier 2 unit, so in a pinch, you may wish to recruit a couple of these units and still be able to reliably count them, even if it is just to soak up while you advance more powerful forces. So always remember that those Marauders will be still very excellent in the end game. And already into a regiment of renown, it's the Icehorn Marauders. So basically, improved stats all across the board, of course, but their main advantage is that they have 2 good abilities. They have immune to psychology, so no fear, no terror effects, and they also have perfect vigor. So this makes them quite a nice addition, especially for that early game. Just count on them on securing a front line really well. That's their main purpose. They will still do some damage. Of course, don't count them on going against any chosen or anything like that, but still very good for the price that you're gonna pay for them. Now we have Marauder Spearmen. They exchange the bronze shield for a spear, so they become anti-large. And they do have a nice bonus versus large, perfect to withstand, you know, light cavalry charges, that sort of idea. Maybe with two of them you can soak up a small monster, that sort of idea, of course. In the late game they do get some decent upgraded stats, especially their melee attack and melee defense, making them kind of like a holding one, but that low armor is going to be the biggest problem that you're going to have with them. So always against light cavalry, maybe medium cavalry in the late game. You'll have better options, of course, but in a pinch, maybe that's what you need. And now into Marauders with great weapons. These are basically the same without the shield, but with a great axe, which means that they are armor piercing. They don't have a lot of melee defense as well, so focusing a lot on that offensive capability. They still have the rage, so they'll get better while in melee. They're kind of vulnerable to missiles because of that armor, low armor, and lack of shield, so be careful with that. In the late game, you can still field a couple of these units if you need them, but overall, you'll have much better options. Of course, this is just speaking in terms of how good they actually become. So they become quite like a tier 2 offensive unit that you may want to use, especially for that armor piercing. But of course, you know, only if you really don't manage to afford anything else. Just always remember that that may be a possibility. And now I have one of my favorites, the Marauder Berserkers. They don't have a lot of armor, but they do have quite a lot of melee attack and weapon strength, not a lot of melee defense, so you guessed it, they are a damage dealer. It says in the unit card, but this one actually applies. So they do have decent armor piercing, I would say, especially because the weapon strength is so high, and that bonus versus infantry helps a lot. Always remember to charge them in. They have such a nice charge bonus that it's really good that you manage to charge them into an enemy. Now, you may notice that these stats are altered. That's because they do have the frenzy, which is always excellent, and then we have the berserk ability. This is an improvement of the rage ability, basically. Of course, the longer you spend in melee, the better for them, the more this increases, and you can get up to 20% physical resistance and up to 13 melee attack. In the stage 2 you get rampage, so be careful, you can lose the control over the unit, but still very powerful, making them very tanky and allowing them to, you know, cleave through the enemies faster. In the late game you can definitely field a couple more units. They do get some increased armor, so a little bit more survivability there and physical resistance, and then even more melee attack and more melee defense and more weapon strength. What else would you want? So basically they become quite a decent solid infantry unit to have. Maybe not in the front line because you lack the shield, but still always consider bringing a couple of these guys to cleave through enemies like butter. Now I have Regiment of Renown, the Brutes of the Hound, for an upgrade for the Marauder Berserkers. These guys basically still a damage dealer. They don't have an issue with leadership because they are unbreakable. That's their main idea. Whatever you send these guys, they'll do all that damage without routing, which is excellent, and especially combined with this, with the Berserk ability, so that leadership is never going down. So yeah, keep them in battle, avoid enemy missiles, and they'll do the job. They also gain the Mark of Khorne, so that's why they do have some spell resistance, which is excellent as well, and they also cause fear. So overall, very important damage dealer for your forces. Now to the unit that you're most likely going to use as a front line, the Marauder Champions. They do gain that shield again, they have much better armor, so it's really tanky. They still retain that speed, which is excellent, you know, for an armored unit, that they are still quite fast on their feet. Melee attack and melee defense, they're very powerful, so they gain much more melee defense, so that's their role, to hold the infantry, the enemy infantry in line, but they also cause some considerable damage. That's a very good weapon strength, very welcoming. If you can manage, you can take advantage of the charge bonus, which is always nice. In the late game you can definitely field a couple of these guys in any army, especially to soak up some missiles, but also consider them to be very good damage dealers actually, with the melee attack, melee defense, weapon strength. Yeah, they'll be tanky, they'll do enough damage to justify them in any of your armies really. They're always very powerful, especially with the next unit that you're about to see. And next we have Marauder champions with great weapons. Steel armors, they lose the shield in exchange for a better weapon, a two-handed weapon, which gives them armor piercing. That's their role. So combining this with the previous unit makes a very solid front line. One unit that can dish out a lot of damage and the other one that can hold the line. It's really perfect. In the late game you can definitely field a couple of these units in each army, maybe even 3, maybe even 4, depending on your play style. Always count that they do get up to nearly 100 armor, which is excellent. More melee attack, more melee defense, more weapon strength. What else do you want? So yeah, these guys combined with the previous one, a very solid straight up front line for your forces. Now to your first missile unit, the Marauder Hunters. These are close quarters infantry, armor piercing missile damage, which is always excellent, and they do have the shield breaker ability. So the enemy that has shields, well, they'll kind of lose their missile block chance, which is excellent. Not a lot of range or ammunition, but they still have decent melee stats, which is good. Always very, very helpful so that you have a little bit more time in case they get in trouble. Now in the late game you can definitely field a couple of these units, especially because of that shield breaker ability, which is always excellent to use. Imagine using them against enemy lords, for instance, or heroes that have a shield, so that's always good to bring a good surprise to them. And always note that their missile strength improves, their ammunition improves, and even their decent melee stats improve, so that's always good to see on a unit that will reach up into the late game in a much better way. Now into a slight variation of the Marauder Hunters, the Javelins one. So basically these are anti-large. They gain just a little bit more range. They lose that armor piercing in favor of a bonus versus large. They don't have a lot of ammunition the same. They still have decent, fairly decent melee stats, but nothing to write home about. Still very vulnerable to enemy missiles or to being run down by cavalry, for instance, because they don't have any defense against the anti-large. You know, their anti-large is strictly the javelins that they can hurl at the enemy, but still they can cause a really powerful surprise. That missile is very powerful, especially in the late game where you can increase that power even a little bit more, which is excellent. A couple of these units in the late game, I like to use them, for instance, against enemy flying units, which typically don't have shields. So basically that means that they'll do a lot of damage to an enemy that doesn't suspect that kind of damage, especially in the Norsca roster. That's why I like to use these guys. A very good cover for flying units, and not as much against cavalry that have shield, so that now you get this whole idea and concept of these units. Very powerful under the right circumstances. Now we have some Marauder Chariots. These are the basic chariot unit, good armor, decent speed, good melee attack and melee defense. For a chariot unit this is actually good. Not a lot of weapon strength, but still has a decent bonus versus infantry, and of course that heavy charge bonus, so you keep them charging. That's how they do their damage. Now a noteworthy effect here is that in the late game they actually become very powerful for one aspect: the melee attack, the melee defense. These are characteristics that typically chariots don't have, and these guys actually gain enough to survive a little bit more in combat. Adding the speed and the charge bonus, they can be quite a nasty surprise to your enemies. If you want a more developed version, the Marauder Ice Wolves Chariots. So in essence, their weapon strength still very decent with the bonus versus infantry, but they also cause frostbite. So good luck running away from these guys. Still overall the same stats, but they do get an armor piercing missile damage. And this is very powerful, especially because they do cause fear. Very good to charge the flanks or rear of enemy. They will cause some damage before reaching them, and then they cause even more damage. The enemy tries to flee and they can't because of that speed, so it's always a very good combination to have, especially in the late game, because look at those stats. They all increase really powerful speed, which means that their missiles, they can actually flee from, you know, some cavalry that tries to chase them, and those missiles are armor piercing. So always count on that. It's not a tactic that is commonly used, but maybe you can find a use for that, and that's all variety for you. So this is a very decent chariot unit that is sometimes overlooked. Now to some Marauder Horsemen. These missile cavalry, they're very basic ones, not a lot of armor, they do have decent speed, not a lot in terms of melee attack or melee defense, very poor, very low, especially in weapon strength, so don't engage them in melee in any circumstance really well, unless the enemy is kind of routing away already, you know. They don't have a lot of range, but that missile strength is still powerful, so that's the main case for these guys. The skirmisher cavalry, it's always very useful, in particular because they do have vanguard deployment and they fire whilst moving. This is the main idea of these cavalry units. In the late game, you can still field a couple of these guys. Of course, they're going to be obsoleted by the next units that I'm going to show, but still, in a rush, you may want to use a couple of these guys, mostly of course because of their missile strength, given how their combat prowess doesn't really improve that much other than, you know, a typical light cavalry. If you want a better version, like I stated, it's the Marauder Horseman with throwing axes. So not only the armor-piercing missile strength that they add, but they also gain a shield, which is so much better. This implies that this cavalry unit is actually performing decently against enemy missiles, for instance. Of course, don't count on them winning too much. They'll just be a little bit more resistant, and that gives you a little bit more flexibility. That's the sole purpose, especially with that missile strength. Note that they lose a little bit of range, but of course, they're armor piercing. That's the main purpose of these guys. They're still vanguard deployed and they still fire whilst moving, so that's perfect. That's exactly what you wish from them. In terms of the late game, you can still field some armies where you use these guys mainly for their skirmishing prowess, maybe to force the enemy into a poor position or just to screen your army while you're advancing, and those armor piercing missiles of course causing some damage to the heavily armored foes. And the ultimate in terms of skirmish cavalry, it's the Marauder Horse Masters. They're still vanguard deployed, they still fire whilst moving, which is excellent, and in overall they gain some armor, they gain a little bit better stats, melee attack, melee defense, kinda like reaching light cavalry status, so they can do some damage here, especially with that charge bonus. Of course, the main idea is the range, is the missile strength. It's very heavy, it's kind of heavy javelin, let's say, cavalry, so they can do a lot of damage. Most of the time, what you'll use them for is basically just to screen your army, your flanks, causing some damage, letting your other units engaging those flanks, and cause the, you know, rout the enemy that is over there. And of course, it's always flexible units, so you can engage with a couple of these guys always, especially against flyers, for instance. It's a very good usage of them. Now, in the late game, of course, you can field a couple of these units in an army, by all means. They do get a little bit improved stats as well in melee, as you can see there, but of course, the main idea that you're going to use these guys is always the missile prowess. Norscan Warhounds. Basically, these are a very light cavalry style unit. They're weak against armor, as it says over there, very fast, the 95 speed. This means that this unit's very good to reach out against those lightly armored targets, causing some damage. Mainly, you're going to use them against enemy artillery or enemy units that are routing, just to make sure that you can catch as many as you can before they leave the place. But of course, very useful against archers, that sort of idea. Now, they do have good melee attack, poor melee defense, very poor melee defense. They'll die very fast. Should be noted that their entity is a small entity. These are not, the enemy won't benefit from having an anti-large bonus against these guys. This is always very good to note. Weapon strength is not bad, but of course not mainly armor piercing. They do have vanguard deployment, they do have strider, which is cool. They don't have any issues with any rough terrain, and in addition a little bit of missile resistance. Now, in terms of the late game, you can always use a couple of these guys, but of course you're going to have better units. It's just interesting how they gain, you know, even more charge bonus, even better speed. So having maybe even one unit of these guys just to chase off enemy artillery and cause some commotion, maybe a case, maybe there's a case for that, but still, of course, you're going to want better units later on. And now for Regiment of Renown, the Beasts of Tashnar, the Norscan Warhounds Regiment of Renown. Basically, they do gain a couple of good things. They gain Frenzy, so that's why you see all those stats increased, and they gain a very nice anti-large bonus. And it's very, very cool. 14 is nothing to shy about. So they're very fast. These guys are perfect to chase off enemy skirmisher cavalry. That's the main purpose of these guys, especially with that bonus versus large, and not being a large target themselves, which is always excellent. They still have some missile resistance, 50%, which is excellent precisely for that role. Chase off enemy missile cavalry with these guys, they'll do their job. And even though I don't have a unit card for these guys, think of them as the same thing as the previous Norsca Warhounds, just that they have the poison effect. Now this is a much better use for this unit. You can field just one of them and going around and just infecting everyone with poison. That's maybe a good use for that unit because you do lack poison overall in your unit roster. Especially in the early to mid game, I wouldn't count on using this too much into the late game, of course, but into the early up to mid game, they may have a good niche use for you guys. If you want the ultimate chaser of missile cavalry, it's the Norscan Ice Wolves. Now these are a very large entity. Actually, it's interesting that they are a large entity. They do have decent stats, not a lot of armor, but very good speed, very good melee attack with frostbite, which is excellent precisely against missile cavalry, and that weapon strength is really cool. It will rip apart enemy missile cavalry. You've seen their stats, so that's their main goal here. They still have that missile resistance, plus 15%, and they have Strider, so they ignore the penalties caused by terrain, which is excellent. They also cause fear. In the late game, of course, their stats gain a little bit better consistency, especially melee attack and melee defense, which is always important. That weapon strength increases really well, including, and if you add that to the speed and the charge bonus, of course, you can do a lot of damage really fast with these guys, which helps their survivability. So they'll cause damage really earlier on, and that means that they'll survive the combat really well. Of course, you're gonna have better units, but still don't neglect these guys, especially in the early to mid game. They can cause some damage to the enemy. The Feral Manticore is a very powerful beast in the skies. They do have decent stats overall, not a lot of armor or leadership, which is the pain, but melee attack, melee defense, it's good, especially for this kind of unit, and the weapon strength is really powerful, actually. A lot of weapon strength for such a unit, with the nice charge bonus. It still causes terror, which is excellent. This unit, the only downside is really that it can go into Rampage. Now, overall, the main uses of the Feral Manticore includes going against other flying units, going against heroes and lords on mounts, just assisting your own lord, taking them out. Pretty much a very good single entity killer. Of course, you can use it against artillery, missiles, especially in the late game. You can still field a couple of these guys. They'll get good stats overall, improved armor, improved melee attack, which is excellent, improved weapon strength, always good. So just make sure that you keep that leadership high, just so that they don't go really fast into Rampage as well. And yeah, that will be it. Norscan Trolls, a very nice monstrous infantry to get started. Very good hit points, actually. That's something that typically we don't talk about, but very good in terms of hit points. Not a lot of armor, very poor leadership, that's the biggest issue of them. And then very good stats, melee attack, melee defense, and powerful armor piercing weapon strength. So it's very much a glass cannon style of unit, but it also has a regeneration, which is excellent. This always helps these sort of units to make sure that they cause some damage, of course. Now, in the late game, you can still field a couple of these guys. They do get, of course, a little bit better leadership overall because of the XP, but not a lot. So overall, you'll have better options, but if you're in a pinch, you may wish to use a couple of these guys, especially with how much they gain in terms of melee capabilities, like the melee attack and the weapon strength. They'll cause a lot of damage very fast, which is always nice. So these ugly fellas, they're Norscan Ice Trolls. Very nice weapon that they have there. It's still very powerful, good armor piercing damage there. The main advantage here is actually just an improvement overall of all stats. They have better armor than the typical trolls. They have good melee attack and melee defense with the frostbite, which is always excellent, so good luck running away from them. And they still have that regeneration, which is always nice. So overall, very good breakers. These guys are very good at breaking enemy lines, trying to get through the enemy line, the front line, into the back line, into their missiles and such. And definitely that's a strategy that Norsca can use really well. Especially in the late game with these guys, you can see their stats improvement. Look at that tremendous armor-piercing weapon strength. Is very powerful, good melee attack overall, and overall with all the improvements, with that ward save, it's really a powerful unit to use overall. Just make sure that you don't get them into enemy missiles, of course, because they'll do short work of them. They don't have a lot of armor, and of course they don't have any shield whatsoever. Now to a very cool unit in the roster, the Skin Wolves. Very fast unit, really. Look at that speed. This is kind of like the Norsca Cavalry, really. They don't have a lot of armor, but they do have very powerful stats, offensive stats, really. That's basically the theme of Norsca. Melee attack, weapon strength, with the main idea that these guys have a powerful bonuses versus large. So that's their strength, that's how you're going to use them. They also have regeneration, they also have frenzy, which is excellent. They have Strider, they have it all. They also have a little bit of physical resistance, so overall a very powerful unit, especially in the late game, as you can see there. Of course, you do have the armored variant, but if you have the need to recruit these guys instead of the other ones, by all means, they're very powerful, very cool, especially with that really amazing weapon strength with that bonus versus large. It's perfect to dish out some damage to the enemy cavalry, for instance. And like I mentioned, an improvement to the Skin Wolves, the Armored Skin Wolves. Basically, similar stats, but they do have quite a nice armor there, so they negate a little bit of the weakness that they have. They're still very fast, they don't lose a lot of speed for that, so very cool to engage enemy cavalry because they still have that anti-large, they still have the frenzy. It's a very powerful unit. As you can see, in the late game you can definitely use a couple of these guys, especially for that idea of a monstrous infantry unit that is actually good versus large, which is perfect for the playstyle. And now for a regiment of renown, the Maws of Savagery. Main idea of these guys is particularly that they do have that vanguard deployment. They still have regeneration, they still have frenzy, and they have armor-piercing weapon damage, which is perfect. So overall, a very good improvement, improved stats altogether, very nice leadership and melee attack as well. So these guys are perfect to chase off enemy cavalry. They'll do a good job, especially if they're armored. That's the main purpose of these guys. Of course, with some support, that's always the theme with the Norsca. They're very good and powerful on offense, but they do require a little bit of support. Female Warriors, yet another monstrous infantry. This is kind of like an upgrade theme here, from the Trolls to the Skin Wolves to the Female Warriors. So these guys are heavily armored, they reduce the speed, of course, they're not as fast, but they do have nice melee attack with armor sundering, so they're perfect to reduce the armor of the enemy, which is excellent. And they also have magical attacks. Melee defense is powerful, so they do survive quite a lot in melee. The weapon strength is mainly armor piercing, and it has a bonuses versus infantry. That's precisely their target. In addition to this, they do have a whopping 45 missile resistance, given because of this from the mist passive ability. As long as their leadership is higher than 50% of base, they gain an extra 20% missile resistance to getting a 20 with added to the base 25, which means 45% missile resistance. Yeah, good luck targeting these guys with enemy missiles. Of course, for the enemy, for the missiles. Now, in the late game, of course, you can field some armies using these guys, especially against the anti-infantry. That's perfect. That's their role, particularly because they gain a lot of armor, melee attack, melee defense, weapon strength, precisely what you wish. Even further, an ward save, making them just that much tankier. And now for Regiment of Renown, the Mist Stalkers. These guys, they do have improved stats altogether, but for the most part, their advantage here is this. They have Stalk. And they also cause terror, which is always excellent. So because they have Stalk and they have Vanguard deployment, they are such a surprise to the enemy. It's really powerful that you have such a really cool unit, you know, very heavily armored with all these stats, you know, magical attacks and standard armor. So this is would already be a tactical unit, let alone with the Stalk, with the Vanguard deployment. You can deploy it anywhere and of course do a lot of damage to the unsuspecting enemy. And one of the ultimate units from the Norscan roster against large entities, it's the Female Warriors with great weapons. Do note they do have a little bit more hit points than this. This is because on the example here that I'm using, they're being attacked by a tower. Oh my god. So armor, leadership, all the basic stats, but they exchange a little bit of this. They still have that standard armor and magical attacks, very powerful, but they now have a bonuses versus large. So overall, using these in conjunction with the other female warriors, and you have a very powerful set of monstrous infantry to dish out against any opponent. They still have that from the mist, so as long as the leadership is high, they'll have even further missile resistance, which is excellent, very nice, and overall they still cause fear, so it's always powerful. A very good addition to your flanks to ensure that you can dish out some damage to the enemy cavalry. In the late game, you can of course field a couple of these guys in each army, maybe even 4 if you wish, a very strong flank heavy, because they'll still cause damage to infantry, but they just have, you know, it's kind of like having minotaurs with great weapons with just better armor and lower speed. That's kind of the sort of idea, the thought process that I want you to have. Just slightly reduced stats in some cases, but very, very good option for you to use against enemy cavalry or enemy monsters. Now to a unit that is in many rosters, and it's still in the Norscan roster, it's the Norscan Giant. Tons of hit points, a lot of weapon strength, not a lot of armor or melee defense, but very good melee attack. That's their strength. They do act like sort of a glass cannon mix. That weapon strength is mainly armor piercing, which is excellent. So of course you can use these guys just as, I like to use them as a single entity killer, because they do cause a lot of damage when they hit. And in the late game you can see those stats improving. They do gain some ward save, they do gain better weapon strength, more armor, more melee attack and defense, which is excellent. Of course you may have better options in your roster, but if you'd like to have a go with them, by all means, they won't let you down. Next we have the Feral Mammoth, a very powerful unit, tons of hit points, look at that. Not a lot of armor or leadership, it's really mostly about the power in terms of hit points. They don't have a lot of melee attack or melee defense. Still very, very good, very powerful weapon strength with the bonuses versus infantry and mainly armor piercing with the decent charge bonus. That's precisely their use. You're going to charge them in, do a lot of damage. They do cause terror, which is excellent, but the main idea is that the main issue with them is that they do go into rampage, which means that they can be heavily wrecked by the enemy if you're not careful. Now, in the late game, of course, you can field a couple of these guys. They get improved stats overall. Nothing in terms of too much leadership, for instance, or too much armor, mostly in their offensive capabilities, really. They do get some nice ward save, 8%. It's not really that much, but still, it's really a powerful unit to field. Of course, you're going to have better improvements of this, but if this is all you have, it will still behave nicely. Now to a unit that is kind of overlooked in the roster that I really like to use, but well, it has some niche usages. It's the Frost Worm. Basically, this is kind of like a dragon, a softer dragon, if you may, that causes magical damage. It has magical attacks and causes frostbite, which is excellent as well. Not a lot in terms of armor, decent, let's say, good speed, good melee attack and melee defense values, good weapon strength, which is mainly armor piercing, so it can be used like any dragon. It does have that ability, the Frost Breath. Again, another magic missile ability that causes very good damage with the frostbite contact, so it's perfect for me, in my opinion, to dish out against fast units like fast enemy flyers or cavalry units to ensure that they don't cause as much damage with their charge, or just to avoid them fleeing the scene so that other units or even the Frostworm can engage them. That's the use that I would use them. Adding to that, it has a chilling aura. This alone, it's very good to ensure that, for instance, your infantry can catch up to any enemy units, or that your trolls or anything else that you're coming up with can chase off the enemy, which is excellent. That's the main purpose. They do cause terror as well, which is always nice on this sort of units. In the late game, they do get some better results here. They do get some ward save. They have that missile resistance already, and of course, increased stats altogether, more armor, more weapon strength, more melee attack, more melee defense. That's always helpful. So a couple of these units, if you can handle the micro with using those breath attacks, then engaging, just make sure that you overcome that fire weakness, which is a big problem for them. If the enemy has fire units, make sure that you get rid of them as soon as possible. Now to a Regiment of Renown, the Cold Voider. Basically, same stats as the other Frostworm, just improved stats overall, I mean. But the main idea here is that it has the Guardian ability. So it's very good to operate in conjunction with a Lord or Hero, which is always excellent, giving just them a little bit more physical resistance. So this is kind of a unit that I would use specifically together with like Wulfric or Throg, just to ensure that they survive a little bit better and to snipe the enemy lord. That's the main purpose of this guy. If you have it in an army, just ensure that you try to snipe the enemy lord as fast as possible, and then with the overall leadership reduction of the enemy because of the lord dying, of course that's how you're going to win that battle. It still has that breath attack, pretty awesome as well, causing that frostbite, still has that chilling aura, so it's quite precisely the same thing, but adding that Guardian ability. One of the best beasts of the game, the War Mammoth, the Soul Crusher, the ROR unit, has tons of hit points, very much improved stats altogether, still that nice weapon strength with armor piercing and bonuses versus infantry, still that missile strength with bonuses versus large, which is excellent. What does he have different? It is a Strider unit, so ignores combat penalties caused by terrain, and it has this ability, Enrage, which gives them a whopping 40% damage resistance, a ward save for 22 seconds. It's perfect to use in many occasions, so that's excellent altogether. A very powerful unit to add in your roster. Finally, we have the War Mammoth War Shrine. So still the same War Mammoth, armored, good speed, melee attack, melee defense. It's kind of low, but then the weapon strength with a focus on armor piercing and bonuses versus infantry, a really nice charge bonus. Main idea here is that it trades off the missile attack for some abilities. First of all, it does have Encourage, which gives leadership buffs, which is always nice. It gives the favor Ruinous Powers, plus 10 leadership to allies in range, which is always excellent. And then it has the Giver of Glory. Now this is an augment that increases with each nearby entity death. So the more entities per unit, the better. So, you know, focus on, you know, those large entities, large units with a lot of entities. That's the case, you know, like 120 plus or something, so that you can get this up to 20% physical resistance to allies in range. Having two of these guys in alongside the front line will make sure that you reach up to the 20% really fast. So that's kind of the strategy that I will use with those, just to augment the front line. But of course you can also go kind of similarly on the flanks, just trying to ensure that your monstrous infantry, for instance, there, maybe your skin wolves, maybe your Fimir warriors, they can obtain as well that physical resistance. So in the late game, by all means, bring these guys up. Same thing as the War Mammoth, they'll just get much better, especially that melee attack, melee defense, one of the weaknesses that they have, or one of the weak points, not weaknesses, but weak points. And certainly in the armor department, really cool. It doesn't get anything with the charge bonus or speed, but still it's a very powerful entity overall. And especially it doesn't hurt that they get at least a little bit of extra ward save. And there we go, that's every single unit from the Norsca roster. A very short roster, but very deadly indeed, as you've seen. So I hope this helps you generate even better armies and just play around a little bit with different army compositions. That's the sole purpose of these videos. Have a wonderful day, guys. Bye bye.